It's the Growing for Market podcast. I used to work for Johnny's doing greenhouse tomato trials. It was one of the things I used to do. And so I would also troubleshoot for growers, so, when they had problems with a Johnny's variety. And you wouldn't believe, or maybe you would, how many times, people would like send in a picture of their sick looking tomato plant, and I'd look at it and try to figure out what's going on. And, a lot of times I'd be like, well, what's in your soil test? And so many times I would hear back, well, we don't have a current soil test. Like, we don't know. And I'm like, the answer to what's going on, like a lot of times I could tell it did look like a nutritional deficiency or something like that. And so I just have to be like, it looks like you have a nutritional deficiency going on. If you got a soil test, that would tell you. So that should help people right there.
Yep. And I'll just say, this is across the board. It's in the field too. And I'm a broken record on this, but it's just data. It's not a religion. Why wouldn't you want to have a little more data about what's going on? It costs $15, $17 in the field, $30 in the tunnel. I mean, that's what, 3, 5, 6 pounds of tomatoes, depending on your price. The payback's crazy. And also you don't see the problems until they're so extreme that there's symptoms. Once you see symptoms, you've already taken a hit. You could be losing 1, 3, 5% and never visually know it. So the payback on a soil test is crazy.
Hello, and welcome to the Growing for Market podcast, where we talk about growing, marketing, and the business of growing vegetables and flowers for local markets like farmers markets, CSAs, farm stands, and local wholesaling. I'm Andrew Mefford, your host and the editor of Growing for Market magazine for 34 years, the magazine for flower and vegetable market farmers. If you're enjoying the podcast, just wait till you see the magazine. Go to growingformarket.com for more. Also, if you could give us a follow and a rating, it really helps other like-minded people find the podcast. And now, let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. Seven Springs Farm Supply has been the market gardener's supply company for over 30 years. Their catalog includes a complete selection of organic fertilizers, pest and disease controls, growing mixes, and cover crop seed. Their experienced team is ready to help you problem solve and find the right solution for your farm and your goals. Seven Springs is committed to providing growers with superior products and service because they understand that their success depends on your success. Request a free paper catalog and learn more at sevenspringsfarmsupply.com. Seven Springs Farm Supply, the market gardener's supply company. Farmers who partnered with Farmhand grew an average of 63% this year because it's more than software. Farmhand acts as your business coach and assistant, helping you sell out, save time, and grow smarter. From marketing to fulfillment to customer support, Farmhand pulls real data from what's worked and what hasn't for other farms and turns it into websites that convert, campaigns that sell, and fulfillment systems that give you your time back. Curious what that looks like? Meet the founder, Ari, at farmhand.partners/GFM and see the same insights and support the fastest growing farms rely on every week. That's farmhand.partners/GFM. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Vern Grubinger to the Growing for Market podcast. Vern is the vegetable and berry specialist with the University of Vermont Extension. Vern has been working with farmers in Vermont for 35 years, conducting applied research and putting together a variety of farmer-centric educational events and products. He has focused quite a bit of this work on high tonal production. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Vern.
It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. And I'm super excited for this interview, not only because I am a big greenhouse tomato nerd. As people may know, I wrote a book called The Greenhouse and Hoop House Growers Handbook, which I'm not here to plug, but just wanted to present my greenhouse nerd credentials. But I am also excited because I know you know a lot and have done a lot of research into greenhouse growing, partially because you have been at the University of Vermont Extension for 35 years. So you must have started in 1991 or 92 in that case, because we here at Growing for Market have a big anniversary coming up in 2026. We'll mark 35 years of Growing for Market. So it's pretty amazing that you've been doing important work for growers there at the UVT Extension also for 35 years. So in as much as you can summarize such an amazing career, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your work over the years with UVT Extension?
Well, I started with UVM extension. It's the Latin for Green Mountains, is the UVM abbreviation. In 1990 as the Windham County agricultural agent. And so my work was immediately rooted in the farm community, advisory boards. Of course, everything was paper and phone back then. And I have just been on a wonderful journey of learning something every day and connecting with just an amazing community of people trying to grow good food. So it's really been a gift. And it's also been cool to sort of watch how things unfold over the years of concepts about, I don't want to say tunnels were new back when I started, but Otho Wells from UNH had really been the proponent. I mean, there were some earlier iterations in, West Virginia and places like that, but he got the ball rolling in the Northeast, and the rate of adoption over my career has just been astronomical. I mean, you can't really find a vegetable farm without a tunnel at this point. Maybe one here or there, but back then it wasn't everybody. And of course now you have farms that, yeah, 5, 10, 15, 20 tunnels, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Technology's improved, the understanding of how to use them has improved, the structures are bigger and wider and better. And of course, erratic weather has moved a lot of production inside just for both protection and quality and yield. So that's been great. But my MO has always been learning with farmers. I never liked the term expert. I feel I'm more of an information networker. I observe, I collect, I modify, I reflect things back out. So this is in every context. From we have conferences and we always have farmer speakers and farmer panels. In fact, that's tended to dominate in my work because that's what farmers really want to hear. But the balance, sometimes you mix in ag service providers, researchers with their perspective and the real world perspective. That's a great combo when it works well. My newsletter, I shifted that to reports from the field where growers write in what's going on rather than me talking at them about stuff that they can read in other state newsletters. And all of the research really has been farmer originated and farmer participation. So I've found that a very satisfying way to work.
Yes. Well, and I think that's one of the really cool things about the benchmark study that we're about to talk about is that it takes information, like you said, coming from growers. So you can look at what's working for people actually in the field on working farms, not just on a trial field or something like that, which trials are important too, but it's also the kind of work you're doing as far as getting responses back from growers to be able to determine what's actually working for people, I think is really useful. And I also do want to say that you guys have some great resources there at UVM. I realized I was using the wrong acronym in that whole intro, right? Okay, so folks, it's UVM for University of Vermont, not UVT. But they have some great resources. In fact, as we mentioned, we had some of your colleagues there at UVM on the podcast a while back talking about food safety. And there you have some great resources that we talked about in that podcast. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, that's the UVM agricultural engineering team in extension, and they have an incredible blog Chris Callahan, Andy Chamberlain put together, and the major pieces of that are post-harvest technology, wash pack shed stuff like case studies, videos, how to build your own spinner from a washing machine. It goes on and on. Then protected culture is a whole nother section related to tunnels, really. And there are heat loss calculators and circulation and ventilation guidance, which includes an engineering interpretation for making things match your situation. And then they have a whole storage, really post-harvest handling stuff. So yeah, very, very rich site for resources.
Yeah, some great free resources there. So we will put a link to that. In fact, Chris Callahan and Andy had also written an article for Growing for Market about keeping produce safe through the wash process, I guess would be that. So yeah, they can go to Vermont, they can go to the Growing for Market archives, but a lot of great information.
Another site at UVM is from the entomology lab, Margaret Skinner and Cheryl Frank Sullivan. They have a whole high tunnel set of web pages in there because they have a project on northern high tunnel production now, but they've been doing work for years on IPM in tunnels and some really cutting edge stuff that you can't find elsewhere. Use of habitat plants to provide all kinds of resources for beneficial insects, and how to use banker plants to grow your own aphid parasitoids, things like that. So that's another site to check out. It's not always easy to navigate these university websites, but you can always contact me if you have trouble finding stuff or find a nearby teenager.
Yeah, well, okay, so at least we're letting folks know it's there. We'll drop some breadcrumbs in the show notes. But it's funny you mentioning about how much tunnel growing has changed, let's say over the last 35 years that, you've been working for UVM and Growing for Market has been going. I think it is worth saying that I think that tunnel growing has really taken off in that time. I think partially you hinted at that with the different technologies as far as good poly covers and things like that, because I know, so a job that my granddad did sometime was to build greenhouse frames for a nursery business in Pennsylvania where he was living. And it was in the day when it was wooden structures with glass panes. And so to think about, I'm not a very good builder, right? So to think about the level of precision you would need to build a greenhouse frame such that then you could slide or attach a pane of glass to it, totally beyond my capabilities. And so, I really think of the growth of polytunnels, right? So piece or two of plastic with metal bows as the democratization of greenhouse and tunnel growing, right? Because you could fairly cheaply and with not that many skills get a protected growing structure, whereas in the past, like in the previous round of technology, right, wooden or metal frames with glass was a lot more expensive and a lot harder to build. So I really think this reflects the democratization of greenhouse growing, which is why you said almost every small farm has one now. We originally started our farm on some family land in Pennsylvania and lost the use of that and moved up to central Maine where I am now. And I remember getting up here and just partially just dealing with the shortness of the season. And also, I remember just looking at all the other farms in our area and being like, well, seems like everybody who's actually making money has a tunnel. We should probably build some. And so that's one of the many things that led me getting really into greenhouses. So probably, I want to say 15 years ago, might not have been, but I have no idea. Probably 15 years ago, I remember going to a presentation that you did at a NOFA Vermont conference, talking about a study you did on greenhouse tomato yields in real world conditions, comparing the amount of nitrogen growers used to the amount of tomato yield that they got, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you today. And one of my takeaways was that there was a wide range of soil fertility that produced at least acceptable yields. Then I came to find out that you did another similar study, the 2024 High Tunnel Tomato Benchmarking Survey. And I want to say how important this kind of work is because it allows you to base your recommendations on real world results from actual working farms. So first, can you tell us a bit about these benchmarking studies, how you conduct them and how you use them to develop recommendations for growers?
Sure. Let's step all the way back sort of to my experience over time with this. I mean, an extension person's role is often helping people with soil testing and, nutrient management, soil health. So help write the recommendations, work with others in the Northeast in the New England Vegetable Management Guide to kind of figure out, based on your soil tests, high, medium, low, what are high, medium, low amounts of nutrients you should provide to certain crops. So that was there for tomatoes, and tomatoes are the dominant, money crop in high tunnels on vegetable farms because they use the vertical space. The yield is 5 to 10 times greater than that in the field. The quality, all the cracking and the late August hurricane remnants that historically ruin a nice crop. There's a ton of reasons to go into tunnels and a ton of reasons to grow tomatoes. So you do your soil test for the tunnel, and what comes back? Everything's off the charts, right? Because think about how people grow in tunnels intuitively, like, wow, there's a lot more plant, a lot more fruit. Like, I'm really going to hit this thing with compost, partially rotted manure. I mean, that's what most growers and a lot of growers are either organic or using kind of organic practices. But the production has largely been in ground in my neck of the woods versus there are some people using grow bags. But I mean, you look around the rest of the world, it's way different. There's a lot of more hydroponic type things or growing in rock wool or core or peat. But in most of the Northeast, and I think a lot of other places, it's in ground. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's super buffered, right? Your risk is way lower. You do not have to dial in. Like in hydroponics, you need to be spot on the money with everything that goes in that water because there's zero buffer. You run out of nitrogen, you're done. Whereas in the soil, organic matter is mineralizing. There's always some nitrogen. Things going to grow if you do nothing. It won't grow great, but it'll grow. So you do your soil test because you're trying to optimize that highly buffered system, which is already pretty decent, but you know it can be better because you're growing a lot of crop and it needs some help with additional nutrient additions. So it dawned on me after a bunch of years of looking at these things of the tests say you're off the charts and you don't need anything, but the crop is responding to fertilization. What's going on? And it's because the tests are calibrated to field production, right? That's what the recommendations were based on, which was, again, a fraction of what you're getting indoors. So of course you have to feed it more. And then start looking in the literature. Canadians have done work on greenhouse tomato production for a long time. There's an article from Hall in like 64 of the crazy total amount of nutrients per acre that were being removed by a mature greenhouse tomato crop. And then it just hits you like, wow, they're taking up 5 to 10 times more potassium than in the field. Of course we need to feed more. And then there's the book Greenhouse, Tomatoes, Cucumbers, and Lettuce out of Whitmer, I think, Michigan State. And they were growing in glass houses in the ground, really interesting, in like the 60s, big glass houses in the ground. Those 3 crops were dominant. And they were using this saturated media test to assess soil fertilities. So that was a big eye-opener for me. Oh, there's a different kind of test you can use. And essentially, that's the potting soil test. And the difference is it's a water extract, and which is what is immediately available. You run water through the soil, what comes off, and that's what a root could take up that minute. Field soil tests use a weak acid to pull out attached nutrients, right? You're more trying to predict what is this crop going to be able to get over the season. So depending on how tightly attached stuff is, a lot more comes off. And the tests are different but complementary. So for a while, I was just using that saturated media test and started doing that like in 2008 to guide the tunnel tomato production because there were recommendations in that Whitmer book. And so I was following those of, hey, if your ppm of phosphorus extracted is this, you need to add this much. And it was all conventional, so I was converting it to organic nutrients, which wasn't that hard. And chugged along with that for a few years. And that was the first benchmarking I did. Was by 2009, I had 75 tunnels, farms that had done this. And so I just plotted them out. And that was an eye-opener. Wow. I mean, pH was actually pretty good among the farms. Most were in the optimal range. There was a few high and a few low. But everything else, there was this large proportion of tunnels that were below optimal and a large above. And so for potassium, for example, the top 25% were, again, had 10 times more potassium than the crop needed, and the bottom 25% had a fraction of what was needed. Very few were in the mid-range, and that was true for available nitrogen and also for potassium. So this was when this work really started for me. And again, I always say the goal is get in the ballpark. Like you have to take these numbers with a grain of salt. There's an error of sampling of where you collected and all that. And it's so different how a tunnel crop performs on one farm versus another, how long you plant, how long they're in there, the soil texture. But like get close to the optimum. That was the goal. If you're on the far end of either of these things, like you definitely are either wasting money and over fertilizing and probably accumulating salts, or you're not getting the yield you can because the plants aren't able to grow. The nutrition's limiting them. So that went on for several years and people started using this. But there was some pushback from my colleagues, and it did make sense of that. Because things like phosphorus are so hard to extract with water, This test was really leading to over-fertilization with phosphorus. Like, you only need a whiff of it on that saturated media test. It's like 1 part per million or more, and then the reserve tests are perfectly good or high. So long story short, this is where I landed on, let's use both of them. And there are things in that saturated media test you cannot get from a field test, right? It gives you soluble salts, which a field test doesn't, because we don't worry about them outside. It rains, it snows, the salts don't build up outdoors in the Northeast, maybe in a desert growing climate, but not here. But in a greenhouse, which kind of is a desert growing climate, you only irrigate a little, salts do build up. They move up with evapotranspiration to the surface of the soil. You keep adding, and so that's a concern. The other thing you don't get in the field is the available nitrate levels, because nitrogen's always changing. I always say it's kind of like asking, what's the temperature of the soil? You go out and do a test. Yeah, in that moment it is, but for the microbes, it all depends on soil moisture and temperature and what they have to feed on, how much N is going to get released as they munch stuff up. So we do have that pre-sidrous nitrate test, which you do in early June to predict for certain long season crops like sweet corn and cabbage, but it wasn't adapted for a tunnel. So having that saturated media test, you get that point in time. And the way I always think of it is, you're about to stick transplants in the soil in this tunnel that's warm and moist and sunny, and they're ready to go. Like that afternoon, they're going to be growing if all goes well. Having this test that extrapolates over the whole growing season is not exactly useful in that minute. That saturated media test tells you, is there nitrogen available now? Is there too much ammonium nitrogen now? Is the salt level okay? Is there soluble potassium? Like, that is important information for the immediate well-being of the plants. How they're going to do over the season in that tunnel, you go back to the regular soil test, which is the extracted nutrients. And in the Northeast, we use the modified Morgan's extract. I just bring that up because labs use different tests. Mm-hmm. And it's important to stick with one kind of extract, or else, it's like mixing English and metric units. You get numbers back and they don't relate to each other, for comparison. So we started doing both of those tests, and then started, again, doing other series of benchmarkings. We did one in 2018, 5 states, 20 tunnels. That's when extension folks went in and took soil samples and tissue samples, and we learned a bunch from that. But then this last year in 2024, focused more on the infrastructure and practices, less on the soils test stuff. So this all comes together with this concept that I have landed on, which is optimizing your tunnel tomato yields in particular. It's like the staves of a barrel concept. There isn't just one stave like, oh, I dialed in the nutrients. Great. Hey, there's no ventilation. Like, the stomates won't open, your plants won't photosynthesize, they won't grow. Oh, I fixed the ventilation and dialed in the nutrients. Oh, my irrigation's inadequate. Well, the roots won't go and get the nutrients where it's dry, so they're still starving. I did all that, but I didn't manage insects, and my plants are so this is where it gets exciting and super complicated, right? Which are the most important staves? Like, which ones, okay, I didn't really dial it in, but the impact is lower on productivity or quality? And which ones have the most impact? And that's what this benchmarking study shed some light on, is that there's a small set of things that differentiated the highest yielding group of tunnel tomato growers from the lowest yielding group. And so I ended up taking, the top 10 growers tunnels and comparing them to the bottom 30 or so. And that is where I'm developing some new recommendations from.
Yeah. And now let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free.
Hey, it's Lindsay from Grown By. There are a lot of farm sales platforms out there, but there's only one that's cooperatively owned by farmers. And that's Grown By, your all-in-one solution to simplify farm sales. I'm proud and excited to share 2 new features now available on top of the tools you already know and love. Number 1, our customizable CSA box builder. It allows your customers to simply say what they'd like in their share, and Grown By matches their preferences with your weekly harvest. Number 2, our new wholesale-only marketplace. Developed with the Culinary Institute of America, it makes your life easier with a dedicated shop for your wholesale customers. No more texting those chefs. Combining retail and wholesale inventories and records. And, drumroll, automatic payments on due dates. No more chasing down late payments. These new features sit alongside our popular online sales and traditional subscription CSA tools, making it easier than ever to manage your farm's business. As you start to get ready for next season, we'd love to hear from you and see if our cooperative can be a partner in growing your farm. Visit us at grownby.com. That's GROWNBY.com.
Today's episode of the Growing for Market podcast is brought to you by BCS America. On our farm, we've had our BCS two-wheel tractor for over a decade, and with no belts to slip, its all-gear-driven construction is still going strong. Though we originally got it for rototilling, we kept it even when we went mostly no-till because it can do so many other things around the farm. From snow blowing, to making raised beds with the rotary plow, to chipping wood, it can do just about anything you might need on a farm with the right attachment. Need to shred a cover crop? A BCS flail mower will make quick work of even the most vigorous cover crop and chop it up so it breaks down quickly. Want to stir in compost or amendments without inverting soil layers? A power harrow turns your BCS into a precise tilthing machine with depth control so you don't mix deeper than you want to. With so many attachments to choose from, it truly is the Swiss Army knife of farm implements. It's why, instead of saying two-wheel tractor, so many people just say BCS. Tractors and attachments are on sale through the end of the year. Visit bcsamerica.com to find sale pricing and your nearest dealer. And now, back to the show. Okay, and I should mention that the slides from the presentation you did about this study are available publicly. I'll put those in the show notes because it's actually, the slideshow is pretty accessible. I think people can scroll through those slides and get the broad shapes of what you're talking about.
So I can hang up now and we're good.
Yeah. All right. See you later, Vern. But I thought that was a really cool format. So what you're talking about is that at the end of the slides, you show sort of like break it down as far as the top 10% of yielders were doing this and compared to how many of the rest of the people were doing it. And you picked out a few different factors where it seemed pretty clear, like the top 10%, most of the people in the top 10% were doing it. Like grafting comes to mind. I think.
Yeah. Well, let me back up maybe. And so folks haven't seen the slide, just give them the quick, what are we talking about?
Yeah, please.
So this was a survey that 47 tunnel growers completed to describe in detail one tunnel on their farm in which they grew red slicing tomatoes in the ground with drip irrigation and trellised. And that was the only requirements, really. Didn't care, organic, conventional, and it had to be in production for at least 3 years. So we recruited 92 folks, I think, that we had worked with over the years. 47 signed up and completed this thing. And then we said, we're going to come back to you at the end of the season and ask you about your yield. And 40 people were able to give useful yield data. Some of it estimates, the yield data is a little squirrely, and that's okay, but it's gets us in the ballpark. So this questionnaire was everything from varieties to infrastructure, size of tunnel, heating, cooling, ventilation, grafting, not, and the prices that they got and the yields and what their top concerns were. So that's what I compiled. And what's interesting is there's a lot of consistency in some areas, and then other areas, not so much. And that's where you start to see the divergence. So to cut to the chase, the average yield across those 40 tunnels that reported was, 2.2 pounds per square foot. So we reduced everything to square foot for comparison. And the marketable yield was like 1.8. There was a lot of variation in culls and seconds and a lot of people not tracking. But that number corresponds with like 24 other studies across the country in high tunnels and temperate zones that I've been able to find. So the 2 pounds per square foot is kind of an industry standard in a way, I would say. Now, The range, though, was 1 to 5 pounds. So the 1 pound, we understand that people either don't care or aren't paying attention. Or, tomatoes aren't their jam. They got other things going on the farm, and they aren't optimizing things. And maybe they don't want to because they don't need to. They have enough tomatoes. It's not a big part of their market. And I think that was true for some CSA farms who we have all this stuff. We just need to get enough tomatoes to give people. And the 5 pounds are the people where tomatoes is what they do, essentially. They have big tunnels. The plants are big. They are in there every day. So that's totally optimized. I would say 4 pounds and up sort of is that. But what I got interested in is, the top 10 yielders is 3.5 pounds average, which was twice the bottom 30, which was 1.7 or something. So what does it take to go from 2 to 2.5 or 2 to 3? You've got all this fixed cost investment, right? And even a lot of the variable costs. It's mostly going to be profit except for harvesting and marketing. So that could really help a lot of people. And so that's kind of how I went at that data of what things could people do at different costs, starting with the least expensive to start to move that needle up in terms of yield.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a great way to look at it because, of course, growers have a lot to do. And at the end of the study, I don't know if you think of it this way, but you have a list of recommendations at the end that I think of as the low-hanging fruit recommendations. Okay, so we talked about the saturated media extract test. I feel like that was probably the lowest hanging fruit, right? For people who aren't already getting a soil test because it's $30, right? Something like that.
Yeah, so it's the long-term high tunnel soil test from the University of Maine. So we've been working with Bruce Hoskins at the University of Maine soil testing lab for a long time on this. And we've worked together on the recommendations that come out. So for $30, you get both tests. You get the regular soil tests, the modified Morgans, and the saturated media. So you can see them side by side, put that together, and you get recommendations. And here is a key point here, based on your yield goals. So for almost all the veg recommendations, it doesn't ask you how much do you expect to get, which of course affects biomass and nutrient uptake and removal and all that. It just assumes, all tomatoes are the same. And we already talked about, right? Field tomatoes are nowhere close to how much you're going to produce in a tunnel and how much nutrients you need. And then you look at other kinds of soil tests like silage corn. That's been on those soil test forms forever. What's your yield expectation? 15, 20, 25, 30 tons to the acre, because it totally the recommendation you're going to get. That's a huge amount of biomass difference. So we did that with the tomatoes too. And it's a little tricky, but we're at a starting place with it of low, I forget what we call it, low, medium, good, excellent. And then since a lot of people don't know, just put in plant height as a proxy, because obviously you're not getting 5 pounds per square foot when your plants are 8 feet tall. Those plants are 15, 20 feet tall. So we put that to help people understand, do not check excellent when you have determinate tomatoes that are only as tall as you are, because that is not going to happen. So that's been the big shift in the testing and the recommendations. And right now, the University of Maine is the only lab offering this as far as I am aware. So that's step one, $30. You get an actual assessment and recommendations to guide what you do. Whether you do it is another question, and it gets into what materials to add and when.
Yeah. Okay, well, that should add some guidance right there. And some people may not know that there's a dedicated greenhouse test. So, right, that would be a step up for people right there, just knowing that test exists.
And the take home from all that, before we get into all of what materials and what do you do, potassium is something that tunnel tomatoes take up in huge quantities. And, it's not an environmental risk or a toxic to plants. It's hard to overdo it. There's some salt concern, I suppose, but most tunnels, before we got into all this, were really under-fertilizing with potassium, and people see a big response in yields. And we've heard from so much, and Becky Madden is my colleague who's really picked up the work on this over the years, and she had a whole project and did part of her dissertation on this. And the grower feedback on how much better their yields are when they start using this test to guide their fertilization is pretty dramatic.
Yeah, I believe it, right? Because potassium is, in addition to a lot of other things, is very important in the ripening process, right? So you've got to think about it. If you want to be ripening a lot of fruit and taking it out of the greenhouse, you got to be supplying enough potassium.
Fruit contain a lot of potassium, but even, potassium and nitrogen are both roughly 4% of the plant on a dry weight basis. That's a lot. I mean, it's way more than phosphorus. And also, most of these houses, because of the compost additions over the years, are got plenty of phosphorus. So this is where it gets tricky, and it's a little bit like out in the field, right? If you keep slapping in compost or composted chicken manure, you're putting in a blended, just say 1-1-1 for lack of a better analysis, which is not what the plants actually need. They need nitrogen and potassium. And, again, these tests do lift up if there's something going on with microbes, but mostly you're managing those two nutrients.
Yeah. Okay, so step one is getting that greenhouse soil test, which to me, it seems like a baseline thing to do to get a soil test. But I used to work for Johnny's doing greenhouse tomato trials. It was one of the things I used to do. And so I would also troubleshoot for growers. So, when they had problems with a Johnny's variety, and you wouldn't believe, or maybe you would, how many times, people would like send in a picture of their sick looking tomato plant, and I'd look at it and try to figure out what's going on. And, a lot of times I'd be like, well, what's in your soil test? And so many times I would hear back, well, we don't have a current soil test. Like, we don't know. And I'm like, the answer to what's going on, like a lot of times I could tell it did look like a nutritional deficiency or something like that. And so I just have to be like, it looks like you have a nutritional deficiency going on. If you got a soil test, that would tell you. So that should help people right there.
Yep. And I'll just say, this is across the board. It's in the field too. And I'm a broken record on this, but it's just data. It's not a religion. Why wouldn't you want to have a little more data about what's going on? It costs, $15, $17 in the field, $30 in the tunnel. I mean, that's what, 3, 5, 6 pounds of tomatoes, depending on your price. The payback's crazy. And also, you don't see the problems until they're so extreme that there's symptoms. Once you see symptoms, you've already taken a hit. You could be losing 1, 3, 5% and never visually know it. So the payback on a soil test is crazy. So there's that. And then knowing what materials. And so like back to the potassium, it's really important to use the fines, the very small particles that will dissolve. The large granules for the field often don't dissolve in the tunnel. Bruce Hoskins once told me he sees the granules in some of the soil test samples that come in. So you think you're adding nutrients, but they're not available. So that's important. And then the nitrogen thing becomes this whole management of when will it release and when do the plants need it. So a lot of growers are front loading with slower release materials, seed meals in particular. Soybean meal, peanut meal are popular. Feather meal is not seeds, but is an option. And then side dressing with Chilean through the fertigation system. Some growers now are going more to side dressing just because it's sometimes you don't know when that front load will release and it's too much too fast and the plants get too lush. So you'd rather be able to spoon feed as you need. Potassium too, you can put through the drip as the fines. So the tissue testing, taking the leaf analysis when the plants are young, just starting to fruit is one way to, again, more data. Is it perfect? No. But you're just trying to have an insight into this black box of growing in the soil, right? It's so magical of what the microbes are doing and the conditions, but that also makes it impenetrable in certain ways. It's the exact opposite of hydroponics, where you take the test, you know exactly what's there, you add something, you see the exact response. It doesn't work like that in soil.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, you're saying you can either try and front load more with slower release sources of fertilizer or do side dressing or fertigation or something like that.
And I think the more advanced growers have landed on a mix. They aren't front loading everything, but a good amount, aiming for 2/3 or so of what the recommendation is, and then spoon feeding the rest with fertigation kind of as observation and tissue tests suggest.
Okay, that makes sense, because one of the things I always tell people is that if you truly applied all the fertility that a long season crop like greenhouse tomatoes need before planting, you would be putting way too much fertilizer on and set yourself up for excessively vegetative growth and other over fertility problems. Like a lot of people know in agriculture, you can have too much of a good thing, right? Over application of most nutrients causes some kind of problem, be it like nitrogen, your plants are going to be too vegetative. A lot of the other nutrients may lock up different nutrients if you put on too much of them. So I think that's important for people to understand. They can't just put everything on. They're probably going to be setting themselves up for problems if they truly put everything that crop needs. You think about how long those tomatoes are going to be in a tunnel, right?
Yeah, it's nuanced though, of course, because there are factors like soil temperature and moisture. So stuff that needs microbial activity to release, if it's dry and cool, nothing's happening. So it's kind of just sitting there. So there's that. And then grafting is a huge factor here too. Like if you have a huge vigorous root system that's going to do a better job at going out and getting everything you put there, you really want to dial it back because that's going to lead to excess consumption and vigor. But a weaker root system, there's less risk of that. So yeah, there's just some other factors to consider. But yeah, I agree with you. It's the kind of conservative approach is don't put it all on up front. But of course, people have been doing that forever with putting all their manure and compost in, if that's all they were relying on. And so some of this is just the timing again. Is it available when the plants need it? Is it all coming off too soon and not slow releasing? So I think we've covered that.
Yeah. Okay. So people can just think about what products are available. Like I was going to ask you what products people are using fertility, because that there's always two questions, it's like, A, how much should I be applying? And then it's like, oh, what are you actually applying to use to get those levels of fertility? And so you just mentioned a number of products. I know in particular, it seems like growers have had a lot of interest in what fertilizers are soluble and break down and dissolve well to go through drip tape and that kind of stuff. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Well, again, you can buy the bulk things individually, the potassium sulfate fines, the Chilean, and do that yourself. There are greenhouse kinds of blends that are organically allowed or not if you don't need them that you can put through the drip. There are people using fish and seaweed and stuff. You just have to be careful of clogging of emitters and microbial growth if you don't flush it right. And I worry about salts with fish. Sometimes it's just so again, moderation. I mean, diversity and moderation are two good principles in fertilization. You're kind of hedging your bets by mixing stuff up and when it will release. And also some of those materials from natural sources have micronutrients and hormones in them, and there's benefits I don't fully understand versus a straight up mineral. But if you're applying compost, you're kind of hedging against that too. So, and then there's, it varies a lot. I mean, in the benchmarking, the majority of growers were putting some compost on, and the majority were using potassium sulfate. And then it was kind of a free-for-all after that.
Okay, so people should know they need to be adding fertility throughout the season, nitrogen, potassium.
And that it needs to be prorated. If you're trying to grow big plants that are in there for a long time, you need more nutrients. That's kind of the take home. And, the same thing, we use this test for if you're growing other things in the tunnel, eggplant, peppers, and lettuce. And really our simple approach at this point is divide by the amount of biomass. So like eggplants and peppers, we're figuring half as much. Lettuce, a quarter or a third. It's just, you think of it that way, is the nutrient needs are proportional to the biomass you're trying to produce.
Okay. And I was always more of a fan of fertigation, partially because sometimes in the past when we side dressed things, it would either not seem to get incorporated or it would actually mold. And so, like we would put side dress fertilizer down by the rows and, it's a very hot, humid environment. And I realized this is not the best way to do this. And so when we did that, just dropping fertilizer in the beds, it just seemed like it sat on the surface and rotted. And that's why I know some growers who use like physical mulches, like landscape fabric or plastic mulch in their greenhouses, would pull that back from the plants, put the side dressing down, and then put the mulch back over. The idea being that then it would be a moisture barrier there. The side dressing would tend to get wet from the irrigation, and then the roots would grow up into it. Do you have anything to say about making sure that nutrients that are side dressed on, that are not being watered in, so being applied in a physical solid form? Do you have any tips for making sure that the plant plant's roots get up into those nutrients instead of just sitting on top of the soil?
If I said side dress earlier, I meant fertigation. I
Okay.
mean, it's so much better, I guess I would say, because for one thing is you have more precision over what you are providing the plants, and you can spoon feed it out. When you apply a material to the surface, like a regular side dress, you're back to kind of that front loading question of you don't really know when it's going to release and whether it matches what the plants need. So that's a concern. In addition to, are things going to get funky under there? I mean, I haven't heard that so much, and there are people doing that, lifting stuff up and throwing it in. But again, it's just you're back to giving up some precision that you could have had of, I know how much N I applied, and also in small doses, right? The plants don't need, you're not going to fertigate like, oh, here's the next 2 months of nitrogen for you. Like, no. You're going to do it every week or other week and keep them chugging along without overfeeding.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I always thought. That's what we got around to, was doing like a weekly fertigation with some potassium and nitrogen and a little bit of everything else in there.
And there's some pretty simple equipment for adding fertigation to your irrigation system. I asked our grower listserv about it, and it ranges all the way from, I forget what it's called, Easy Grow or something. I mean, some, $100 or $200 to getting up to dosatrons and things. So it's all about how much precision and automation you want.
Yeah, so that's all people have to do is get an injector to be able to apply that fertilizer, and then you can be pretty sure the day it goes on, it's available to the plants instead of wondering if it's sitting on the soil surface. So, okay. Well, I know you wanted to talk about how planting dates and length of growing season varied and interact, which is something I initially overlooked because I thought, well, it's pretty straightforward. If you have plants in the ground longer, you'll get more yield. And I figured timing ground was probably a factor of whether growers were heating or not. But yeah, what can we say about how planting dates and length of growing season vary and interact?
It was a little surprising that we didn't pull out like, oh, here's a thing that's totally correlated with yield. Like one thing, planting date, or whether or not you graft, or long story short, nothing. There was not one thing. It's back to that staves things. It was clusters. And then as you start to think more about it, it's sort of like there's reasons why. So one of them is, you plant early, you should have a longer growing season and get more yield. But then when I looked at the planting dates of the farms planting early and whether they had in-ground heating, there was a disconnect. There's a bunch of farms sticking plants in cold soil that are probably just sitting there. And there's good research out of Quebec, again, 20 years ago that just showed if you plant, before, I forget what they did up there, it was late April and the first week of May, they got a 40% yield bump from in-ground heat. And again, 1 or 2 years in one location, but Martin Gent did work down in Connecticut too, showing nutrient deficiencies in cold soil. So intuitively, growers know plants like tomatoes don't start to grow till the soil is warm. So why are we planting them? And I think some of the explanation is, well, it's warm in the tunnel, right? It's sunny and hot. It feels warm, but heat rises. So the soil, very few growers I know actually stick a thermometer in the soil to see what the temperature is. So there's a low-cost investment. But the people that are getting the benefit of that early planting date are planting into warm soil. So that's another, I would say, medium-cost investment to have a domestic hot water heater and the tubing that goes with it. But you kind of need air heat too, because that's not going to be enough to actually heat the air without toasting the plants. I don't know if you can even do it. I mean, you're only trying to get the soil to 75 degrees or something with 100-odd degree hot water. So it's not a lot of heat. But air heat was another thing that was correlated with higher yields. And again, there's a little confusion there because you probably have a lot of the other infrastructure that goes with it. So you kind of have to decide, are you a shorter season, less investment, lower infrastructure grower, or if you're trying to get in there early and get crops early, to put in heat. So then the other thing happens at the other end where, and we just visited some tunnels the other day where there's still fruit there, but for whatever reason, the growers are done. It might just be exhaustion. It might be they haven't managed disease. It might be their markets. There's a lot of tunnel tomatoes out there. The field tomatoes are coming in. So you do have to ask yourself that of how long do I want my growing season to go? But there's another interesting consideration in this whole thing, and Jacques Thoreau from Quebec, a tomato consultant who's been working with some of our farmers, turned me on to this. It's just thinking about when sunlight is maximum, which is pretty early in the season, right? You're talking about middle of June to middle of July is the most light, the most photosynthetic capacity to produce biomass and fruit. And if you only have a little plant going into that period, you're wasting all that energy, right? You're trying to grow a bigger plant and fruit later as the solar energy is declining. So there's a reason to think about your planting date and the heat and getting earlier biomass and fruit, even if you end earlier than the fruit production would dictate.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And now let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. If you have never attended an ASCFG conference, there is no better time to invest in yourself. The Association of Specialty Cut Flowers is welcoming Growing for Market readers to register at the ASCFG member rate for the 2026 conference in Albuquerque on January 13th and 14th. You'll meet well-known podcasters Charlotte Smith of the Profitable Mindset podcast and Scott Shepard of the Flower podcast. These dynamic speakers, along with Dr. John Dole, Laura Langenick, and Robert Washington Vaughns, fill out the first day of sessions. Day one will be topped off with a trade show and social time where you can meet industry suppliers and mingle with new friends over appetizers and drinks. There will be something for everyone with concurrent sessions on day two. Choose which sessions you'll attend and team up with a friend to swap notes from one another. When asked what the best part of being at an ASCFG conference is, Dave Dowling said, "The conversations with other growers during the breaks. Taking in all the info you weren't expecting to learn." Rebecca Kutzer Rice of Moonshot Farm shares, "Every time I attend an ASCFG conference, my farm leaps ahead and I make lifelong friends. Can't wait to meet you in Albuquerque." Visit ascfg.org for conference information. A well-built high tunnel is one of the smartest investments a small farm can make. It protects your crops, extends your season, and keeps income rolling in even through winter. Nifty Hoops builds complete Gothic high tunnels that are easy to install and built to last. Their easy, bolt-together construction makes setup straightforward and efficient, whether it's a small backyard hoop house or a dozen large production-scale high tunnels. Especially through their community build option, where professional builders work alongside your crew, family, or neighbors to build each structure, usually in a single day. Most growers go with Nifty's full setup: steel-framed end walls, roll-up sides, baseboards, double plastic with inflation, automated vents, and real doors, all priced to make the best choice the easy one. Nifty is a small crew out of Michigan using U.S. steel and working hands-on with growers across the country. They'll help evaluate your site, handle NRCS paperwork, and if they're building with you, they'll even float your cost share until after the build. Visit niftyhoops.com to learn more. Farm more seasons. Grow more food. Nifty Hoops. And now, back to the show. And I know one way growers can get a bigger plant without putting it out in cold soil is just to plan on potting their tomatoes up a little bit more than, say, field tomatoes. That way, if they have the propagation space, they can basically grow a really big tomato plant. Like, I feel that's pretty common in big commercial tomato greenhouses that I've seen, is they plant a big plant, right? Because they heat that nursery space, which is fairly economical compared to heating a whole production greenhouse. And so they just put a big plant in the ground and it's ready to take off. But okay, that's good to know.
So a couple other areas of differentiation have to do with the air. So one of the biggest difference between the high yielding and the low yielding tunnels was automatic roll-up sides.
I saw that, yeah.
And the more you start to think about this, the more sense it makes, right? What's the normal practice? Most tunnels, you go out in the morning, you roll things up. You go out at night, you roll them down. What's happening in the real world? The sun is coming in, it's coming out, it rains, it stops. So people with the automatic sides see them going up and down during the day
all
to
day
adjust.
Long. Yeah.
So that is telling you, whoa, this other system is not optimizing the growing environment compared to the automation. And then just the labor savings as you start to think this through, oh my gosh, that is one less thing to do. Go out, roll them up, roll them down. So I'm seeing pretty rapid adoption currently of automatic sides, and some of it's just word of mouth is spreading among growers, and the price of these systems has come down. So that's a thing we're really pushing growers to consider. You're talking whatever, 2,000-3,000 a tunnel, depending on the brand and the controllers and all that. And your tunnel has to be constructed properly for them to work. But I do visit a lot of farms and like, wow, why aren't the sides up? It's like, it's a hot, you're in the tunnel, it's crazy hot and humid. Oh, just nobody got to it, or the other way around. It's like, it's raining, it's cold, feels like it's going to snow. You should lower those sides. So this takes care of that few. And one thing Becky Madden told me, who's also a tomato grower, and she put these in some of her tunnels, is that her intuition about whether sides needed to be up and down from her physical experience of the conditions in the tunnel did not match the machinery that is measuring temperature and humidity. Like, you were off the mark of what should happen to those sides based on your physiology versus a mechanical measure of temperature.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm such a fan of automation because of what you just said. There's no way that a human can make the small adjustments throughout the day, let alone like running back from being in some other part of the farm and coming back to, make roll up side adjustments. People aren't going to do that. And they don't know. There's just no way. This is one place where technology just can do a better job.
Yeah. And then the quality of life. You go off to farmer's market, you don't have to worry about whether the sides are in the wrong position and it's going to hurt the crop.
Yeah.
So the other piece related to air, so that's ventilation, is circulation. And this is where horizontal airflow fans was another area where the high yielding tunnels largely have them. And I forgot the number exactly, but only half of the low yielding tunnels do. And this, again, as I started to dig into it, made more and more sense to me. I always thought of them primarily for your mixing the temperature and the humidity in the house, keeping that uniform. And that is true. The insight I got from finding some studies was you're mixing CO2. In the greenhouse on a sunny day where there's no wind, there's a CO2 deficit around the leaves. Those plants are sucking it all up, and it's not getting there in a way that allows them to use all the sunshine. And this one study compared having those fans to CO2 additions to both or none. So either the HAF fans or CO2, you got a big bump over not having either. But putting them together, you didn't get that much more.
Oh, interesting.
So essentially, I think of HAF is like a CO2 addition, simply by moving the CO2 that is in the house closer to the leaves when they're using it up. So that said, I also visit a lot of tunnels where the fans, it's not the right kind of fan, it's not moving enough air, they're not in the right place. So there's great documentation from the 60s from the University of Connecticut, and then John Bartok has put this out. The diagrams are there, how many CFM those fans are supposed to move, where they're supposed to be placed. It's easy to put them in the right way, but I do sense some growers like, oh, I'm just going to get a box fan, it's cheaper, actually uses more electricity. So that's, again, a mid-level investment. It's going to cost, depending on, whether you have the wiring and all that, but several $1,000s to do a tunnel. But I've had feedback from growers that didn't have them and then do it like, oh my gosh, I had no idea this was going to be such a dramatic improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. And that graph of the CO2 mixing is in the slides for the presentation that we're going to link you to in the show notes if people want to see that. That's a really good suggestion because, I encourage growers to think about carbon dioxide almost like fertilizer that plants take from the air, right? Because they need that carbon dioxide as part of the photosynthetic process. So what you're getting at is on a sunny day that there's not much breeze, just like we would breathe up all the oxygen if we were in a box, if there's not much air circulation, the tomato plants will use up the carbon dioxide, and they'll be in carbon dioxide deficiency unless you're supplementing CO2, or more likely for this type of grower is circulating that air. And then you'll get so many other benefits from circulating that air too, as far as less foliar disease and better temperature mixing in the greenhouse. It's definitely worth it to install those half fans.
Yeah. And I think there's even an additional importance in the high tunnel tomatoes because of the structure of the crop. So a lot of these studies were not with a tunnel full of biomass, right? Like the passive ventilation is not moving the air in the same way that it would like on a bench top full of potted plants or where some of these studies are done. So it takes some power to, like John Bartok's stuff always says, air is heavy. And to keep it moving, you need the right kind of fans. And I always like to see the leaves just shaking ever so slightly in as many places as possible in the tunnel. And I'm starting to come to the conclusion, or I'm questioning, like especially some of these longer tunnels, I don't know if 4 fans is enough. I'm wondering if people should have 6. So we are setting up some research. Becky Madden is looking at HAF and automatic roll-up sides and not, and I think we'll start to learn more about what's going on with temperature, humidity, CO2, and that might inform some changes to the recommendations.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to see that research, because it does seem like ventilation's the kind of thing you almost can't have too much.
Well, this was another thing in the study. So I looked at the American Society of Engineer recommendation for how much total ventilation opening you should have in a passively ventilated greenhouse. And it's a little tricky because it's like based on ridge vent plus side vent. But the ratio should be like you should have about 1/3 of your floor space in total openings up above. And again, you look at, there wasn't a big difference across the high yielding and low yielding tunnels, but there are a whole bunch of tunnels that don't have an optimal amount of openings. And again, that's fixable with various expenses. But one thing are those gable vents in the end, to just make a big triangle as big as you can that you can open one way or another with hinges and pulleys. You see a lot of different iterations of that out there, but and it's also for disease management. It lets that hot, humid air get out when it can't get out through the side vents when it's trapped up high in a big bubble. So we've seen a lot of growers putting that in. I mean, ridge vents are great. They're not cheap, like $6 to $8 for a tunnel, I think. And then growers love them or hate them for changing the plastic and that type of thing. But that is kind of the Cadillac of passive ventilation. And then, of course, having roll-up sides that go up high. So we're seeing more and more people building tunnels with really high vertical sidewalls, so you can get a full 6 or 8 feet of roll-up versus the old days you had the little, stuck with 3 or 4 feet. And so for some older tunnels, you can put on the ground post extensions to jack them up. Of course, reinforce the structure if you need to for rigidity, but then you can have a much higher roll-up.
Yeah, absolutely. We did that with our tunnels, our 2 tunnels that we grow tomatoes and cucumbers in. We bought the package that has the longer ground posts. And so I think our top wire ends up being, 9 feet off the ground. And that, I'm so glad we did that. It was a little bit more expensive up front on the high tunnels, but that extra space inside there. And then, like you're saying, you get a much bigger roll-up side opening when you go with the taller ground posts. I think that ventilation has been clutch for us. I was a little surprised to see in your benchmarking study that only about half of growers are using grafted plants. And there was a big correlation there. Let's see, 80% of the top 10% of growers used grafted plants and only 35% of the rest did. So it seems like there's a big difference there. I would have thought it would be more than that based on the benefits of grafting. Do you make a recommendation to growers to graft? And do you have any idea why more growers aren't using grafted plants?
I'm a big fan of bioassays for a lot of different situations. And this is one situation where you could start by just growing a small number of grafted plants next to your ungrafted and convince yourself it's worth it or not. Because I have seen in tunnels where conditions are really optimized in the soil, the nutrients are dialed in, irrigation's good, there's lack of soil-borne diseases, that there isn't much difference with grafted plants. That vigorous root system is really making up for something being off with a regular root system. So you'll have a more vigorous plant, but how much more vigorous is the question. And then does it make it worth the extra expense of whatever it costs to buy those plants or to go through the learning curve of how to graft them yourself? But certainly there's a lot of benefits, and disease management, I think, is how this all started. Like back in the day when buffalo was the dominant tunnel variety, it had a pretty weak root system and was prone to disease, and grafting just made a huge difference. And of course, there's different levels of vigor. So it was interesting. Maxifort was far and away the most popular rootstock cultivar, and that's been around for quite a while, and seems like it's still working. And we just had some communication with a grower that's got corky root disease identified, and I found a study out west that, wow, Maxifort really helped manage that, but some of the other rootstocks didn't. So that's another thing, is it isn't just vigor. There's other reasons to explore one rootstock over another. But it does make sense to me, even buying the plants. Again, it's a couple of pounds worth of fruit cost per grafted plant, if that. So I'm not sure what I don't know if it's resistance or lack of awareness of the benefits are.
Yeah, that might be an interesting thing. We could do a survey on social media or something. But I mean, like growing for market, because that's one thing. I did a lot of grafting and a lot of trials on grafted plants when I was doing trials at Johnny's, and every single trial that I did, comparing, side by side grafted plants and ungrafted, the grafted plants always did better. And so, well, I have a personal theory that it's a pain, it's a tedious thing. It's a tedious process. Like I've done a lot of it myself. That's how I know it's tedious. And my own theory is that if grafted plants were more widely available, more people would probably buy them.
Yeah. And you're bringing in plants. So with just like other kind of horticultural starts, quote unquote, right? You need to be careful about potential for infestations that come with them. So, but we have some local suppliers that are pretty credible and reliable. I mean, they're not producing huge volumes, but I know there's one farm up in northern Vermont. That's all they do, I think, is their main business is grafted plants. I don't know how many more they could do, but it seems like an area for somebody to expand into, perhaps as a supplier.
Well, we've thought about it. So my wife has a nursery business here on our farm in central Maine. And a couple of years ago, we did a pilot grow. She sells a lot of plants for retail, and also in the past has done flats of plants for other farms. And so we did, I forget a few hundred plants that we sold, sort of like to see if we wanted to get into that. And that was successful. It did well as far as, I think I grafted all of them, most or all of them. And they did well for the grower. And I forget whatever, it just, at the time it didn't fit. I actually forget exactly why my wife didn't want to do it, but it's really her business. So it's more like I would sort of like help do the grafting part, but she had to decide whether it was something she wanted to add to her lineup. And at least at the time, it didn't really fit what she wanted to do with the business. But I've always thought but it's something I still think about from time to time. I don't know if she might ever change her mind about that, because okay, I'm glad there's sources of grafted plants there in Vermont. I'm actually, other than mail order sources, I'm not aware of that many places that are selling them around here. My hunch is that more growers would use grafted plants if they could get them from the locally or regionally from somebody they know, where they didn't have to order them through the mail. So.
Yeah. We did have a bit of a fiasco a few years back with powdery mildew coming in from plants from far away, but growers buy, sweet potato slips and onion plants and, I mean, ginger. Like there's a lot of things that are coming in from far away. And I think it's just a matter of being careful and observing and having an infirmary before you put everything out to make sure it doesn't go sideways after you've put them all in the greenhouse. And I mean, some stuff's hard with disease. It doesn't show up till later, but yeah, certainly a local source is good, not just for that, but for strengthening our own growing community. So tell your wife to get on it. Come on.
All right, I'll tell her you said that. I'm sure she listens to the podcast, and I do think it would be like, I realize there's like this whole other extra layer of logistics as far as producing the seedlings, but at the same time I would love to see it happen, just because I think, well, I could test that theory if part of the reason that people are not using grafted plants is because they don't have a like reliable local source. And I also think it would be a good thing, like that would be a great thing for us to be able to offer, say, like grafted plants,
Yeah, then you can do strawberry plugs while you're at it.
I'll tell her she needs to get strawberry plugs too. All right. Well, one of the cool things about your benchmarking study is that after you surveyed your growers about their practices, that, as we talked about, you're able to separate the top 10% by yield and look at the differences in growing practices between that top 10% and everyone else. And so I just made some notes here. A few of my takeaways, tell me if I got any of these wrong, but a few of my takeaways were that 70% of the top 10 used automated roll-up sides and only 10% of the rest did. So that's a pretty big difference there. As I mentioned, 80% of the top 10 used grafted plants and only 35% of the rest did. So big difference there. 90% of the top 10 used the long-term soil test and only half of the rest did. So we talked about the saturated media extract test, and those seem like three big takeaways for things that the top 10% are doing. Are there any other things that the highest yielding growers are doing that we should focus on?
There were some things that were hard to extract from the survey, but I think are worth thinking about. And one is the use of biological controls for insect pests. So the majority of growers were doing something. And so that's why it's hard to separate the percent of like, well, what did you actually do? And they entered into a box or checked some things. I did this, this, and this. But there's some low-cost things that just anecdotally, when I go out to visit farms, I don't see the level of adoption that I think would be desirable. And one of those is the use of habitat plants to provide habitat, nectar, and sometimes a place for the prey to congregate so the good guys can eat them. So it's like this bucket of multiple ways of supporting biological controls in your greenhouse. So again, the UVM entomology lab, Margaret Skinner, Cheryl Frank Sullivan had done a lot and published a lot on that. But the simplest thing to do is like plant some alyssum at the end of every row or in between your rows, or like this is really turning out to be kind of I would say the star of the of the habitat plant system. But they're doing, it depends what you want to do, right? So having beans as a heads up for spider mite infestation, and so the list goes on. There's a way to do these things, and it's very low cost. You're talking about starting a few plants and getting them out in the tunnel. So that seems like an area where people could pay more attention, and it didn't necessarily show up in that data because some of it doesn't help unless you have a problem that you're heading off. So how does that get conflated with what people checked and what they report with yield? But that I would highly recommend, and it's simpler than purchasing in biological controls, which is also a recommended practice. And certainly for things like whitefly, Encarsia is something I think everyone's familiar with. And aphids gets a little trickier based on aphid species and what you buy when. And some growers were doing banker plants, raising their own, but I would sort of place that in the grafting category. Is you need somebody who is into it and dialed in and going to do it right. You can't get some things wrong and have banker plants work. Just like grafting, there's certain basic procedures that must be followed, and then it will work. But if you don't have the passion for that, it's probably going to fall off your radar and go sideways. So the biological controls is one thing. The other thing was interesting is diseases were at the top of the list of grower concerns, along with soil fertility. And the majority of growers were spraying something for disease control. But again, you go to a lot of houses where the spray system isn't very good. There's the hand pump, backpack, something or other. And so a lot of these issues, good coverage is essential because you can't help infected tissue. You're trying to protect healthy stuff by putting something on it that will either kill the disease spore or prevent it from germinating, whatever. So the higher end growers, for lack of a better word, they're spending more money and making more money in their tunnels, have electric backpack sprayers. and they're not messing around with hand pumps. I mean, even that can be laborious if you have a lot of tunnels and large tunnels, but those are, I don't know, I forget what the dram ones run, $400 or something. It's not a huge investment, but save your shoulders and elbows if nothing else. So that's another area that jumped out. And then irrigation is huge. So Becky Madden's dissertation work found a statistical difference between 1 drip line per bed and 4, I think it was, in yield. We didn't ask the question quite the same way because everybody's got different bed orientation and blah, blah, blah. I was just trying to get the number of drip lines per linear foot of width in the tunnel. So it didn't correlate with yield, but we know, again, from observation, I go visit tunnels and you stick your hand in the soil next to the plant 10 inches out and it's dry. So this varies with soil texture. The heavier clay type soils, the water's going to move sideways better. Sandy soils is going to go down. But after that 2018 study we did in Becky's work, lots of growers have gone to 4 lines per bed from 1 or 2. And it just makes sense, right? You want the root system to go into as much of your soil as possible and get all those nutrients that you have applied. And if you don't think they're doing that, the safest course of action is to spread the water out. That's a pretty low cost thing to do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that was one of the fairly cheap, low hanging fruits at the end of your report, because I feel like I've seen a lot of growers start doing that. Of essentially, it translates into 4 drip tapes per bed, right? Because I think it's pretty. I think it used to be pretty common to see 2, and now just what you said is like, of course, the roots aren't going to grow where there's no moisture, and so you know think about how big a tomato root system can get if you're only wetting down right close to the plant. And especially, if you have sandy soil where the water tends to go straight down, there's probably a lot of the growing bed that the roots aren't really going into if it's not getting wet. And also, you got to think, you probably put fertilizer there too, right? Like you mentioned about Bruce Hoskins seeing what potassium crystals in the soil test. So knowing you put fertilizer down and it's never getting dissolved and used by roots because it's never getting wet. So I feel like that's pretty straightforward and also pretty cheap and easy for a lot of people because people are already putting drip tape down. It's like, just put 4 drip tapes to wet the whole bed down. And likewise, would you say to confine putting fertilizer in the beds, right? Because we're talking about how the pathways aren't going to get wet. There's no point in putting fertilizer in the pathway because it's just going to be dry and the roots aren't going to get over there anyway, right? So
yeah, I mean, I hesitate a little bit just because there's so many different configurations out there of layout. Got people with single rows, pretty tight, multiple plants in beds, whether they're 2 liters grafted going out. But in general, I agree with what you said. But I think the main point is wherever you think roots can go, there should be moisture. And sometimes that might be under the walkways too, depending on how compacted they are and your past practices of spreading nutrients. But if the water's not getting there, for sure they won't. Obviously, you don't want your walkways muddy and wet. But in general, people seem to have wide enough beds that four lines make sense. And making sure they're working is another thing, which isn't that hard to do. But sometimes if you never pull one up and see if anything's dripping, you don't find out till the plants start to look weird.
Yeah, that's a bad way to find out. So.
And then you get into the cluster thinning and trellising, and it's kind of all over the board there. Although I would say it seems like thinning to 4 or 5 fruit per cluster to manage the fruit load on the plant for consistent yield is the best practice. Again, cultivar, your early markets, there's other things to think about, but that's something as a general recommendation I think is solid. And the trellising just depends if you can deal with it, how long your season is. We did visit Intervale Community Farm in a workshop a couple weeks ago, and Andy Jones has custom built these harvest carts that roll alongside very tall plants, so that really helps a situation like that. The Canadians have these spiffy things on rails that you can get jacked up into the plants and you don't have to lower them. But thinking of some way to, if you aren't going to lower, to get more efficiency out of the labor. Labor for pruning and trellising was pretty high up there as a grower concern. That was news to me, although not a surprise once you think about it.
Okay.
And then let's just talk about what was consistent. It was crazy how many of the tunnels are roughly 30 by 96. It's like that, which makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. You don't have to get into huge reinforcement or whatever for bigger houses or site prep, and smaller ones, are less buffered against changes. There's just less mass of soil and air, so they're going to swing more temperature-wise and can still have decent passive ventilation in that width, so that makes sense. And pricing, I was pretty surprised about that. Of like $4, $4 to $5 is where almost everybody's at. It's $4.56, I think, was the average for retail price per pound. I just wouldn't have expected it to be that consistent, but it was. And cultivars was more consistent than I would have guessed. Geronimo was very widely grown, followed by Rebelski, and then there was a bunch of second tier, Cayman, B Orange, etc. But I knew Geronimo was popular, but it was more widely grown than I thought.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too, partially just because Geronimo is such an old variety.
Well, Geronimo on Maxifort, it's like old school.
Yeah,
still works.
Okay. So, and that is also in the slides that we're going to be sharing in the show notes. You have, I don't know what's called, one of those graphs where,
Pie chart.
A pie. Yeah, well, you have one of those things where all the names of the different
varieties.
That's
a word cloud.
A word cloud, yeah. So, if people are curious what other people are using, they can go check out those slides, because they have the, Geronimo's really big because a lot of people used it. Yeah, and I noticed Rebelski's really big. It's one of those word cloud where the more frequent responses show up bigger. So Geronimo's giant, Rebelski's big, and then you can see what other people are using in there. I thought that was useful.
So we're probably wrapping up, but I want to end with one teaser, I guess, of data we didn't process. So as an incentive to participate in this study, I offered all the growers a free comprehensive irrigation water test out of Penn State. It's like $60, and it analyzes all of the constituents, both nutrients, alkalinity, acidity, and I haven't yet processed the data, but one thing we're trying to unpack is a lot of tunnels have water that is high in pH and high in alkalinity, and soils that are high in pH from that, and people have been adding sulfur to bring them down. And the alarms should be going off on a bunch of these farms, and yet the plants seem to be growing quite well. And I've only started to dig in, but one thing has revealed itself. Most of the studies about this issue have been done in potted plants, and a lot of them in cells, transplant production. So basically you have a system that is not well buffered compared to in ground. And tomatoes are kind of weeds, right? They really tolerate a lot. Like, I've seen salt tests where you think these plants should be dead, and they're just sucking up the potassium. And that was years ago. I learned that, like, wait a minute, these numbers are generalized from pot studies and kind of all vegetables versus herbs or something. So yeah, leafy greens, herbs, lots of concern. And direct seeded in tunnels, we've seen, you got a white crust there and you seed into it and nothing grows. And like, oh my gosh, you test that conductivity in that top 1 inch. And Bruce Hoskins did some studies on this too, showing the stratification of salts, like they're up high and not down low. So mixing those soils is really important to get. And a lot of those salts are nutrients. So to put them back throughout the soil profile, or you can try washing them down in with water, which takes a lot of water to move them down. But the issue of what is the optimal irrigation water and whether people should be treating with acid, which in organic growers' cases, citric acid is the only option, which is expensive. And so right now my answer is I don't know. But I think there's going to be more flexibility in there than we thought about how well plants can do with water that's outside what you see as the published range of optimal.
And you're talking because of that, if your water is acidic or basic, like watering in a greenhouse that's not getting any rain, you mean that if you water over the course of a season and over courses of years, using, say, acidic water is going to make your soil acidic over time?
It's moving it in that direction. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because I've talked to growers who were surprised that there was sort of like, I don't know, maybe they hadn't done a soil test for a few years, and then all of a sudden their soil was very acidic or very basic, and they didn't think about how if their water was acidic or basic, and that's the only water that's going into that tunnel, that's going to, of course, drive the soil acidic or basic over time. So yeah, well, I'll be curious. Let us know when you have that analysis done. Maybe we should talk again.
I mean, and one other piece of this is back to the soil recommendations. We can circle back to kind of what we started with, which is for a long time I've been recommending the use of peat moss as a way to maintain organic matter levels, like when your phosphorus is off the charts high, but when you're getting your nitrogen, you don't need the compost for your nitrogen because you have other sources. So the peat moss is also a way to acidify your soil. And we misspoke earlier. It's a lot of this water is really high pH and high alkalinity. It's not acidifying, it's bringing the pH up. And this is where people have been adding sulfur, which does not seem to be reacting. There's lots of sulfur in the soil, but it's not changing the pH. And I think it is a microbial process, and maybe it's just not warm and moist long enough in there for them to do that. I don't understand what's going on there. But I think it's just another reason to consider peat moss as a soil amendment for organic matter and acidification.
Right. Okay. Because the problem that people tend to have is that if they're adding compost for organic matter and fertility, there tends to be, if they do that year after year, there tends to be too much phosphorus over time. And so the peat moss is a way to add organic matter without adding more phosphorus. That's what you're saying, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And to not have imprecise nitrogen source, like you don't really know how much is coming off or when, so you're making your dependence less on the compost for N and K, which you can both manage very precisely, as we talked about earlier. See, we came all the way back to what we started with.
Okay, well, that's nice. That's nice that we came back around. Yeah, I mean, that's most of what I had to ask you. I did want to, I don't know if this is even something you do want to talk about quickly. One of my questions was going to be how to assess the starting baseline and then assess improvements over time.
Yeah, no, it's important because that's another thing that really revealed itself from all of the benchmarking studies we did.
Yeah, it's like, how are growers going to know if this stuff is working?
Significant portion of growers do not have a very good handle on their yields. And I get it. You're growing all kinds of things. It's sort of all coming out in the wash. You have sales records. It's intuitive. But again, just like the temperature in the tunnel, I don't know that perceptions are always accurate. And what I think is really important is you have all these fixed costs. When you take that average price and the average yield, I forget what it's like 26,000 gross a year out of a tunnel. So if you move that needle to get 5 or 10% more yield, that's real money. But how would you know? Because that's probably down at the level of where it is lost, and the records aren't precise enough to pick that up. So Becky and I have struggled with this over the years with different projects, and I think some common sense approaches make sense, which is you don't have to weigh everything. Like pick a few representative plants and have a scale and a clipboard and weigh those. Or carefully count boxes that come out and know the weight of the box. And the same thing, fill the buckets with culls and know the weight of the bucket. But have some system where the amount of error in it is small enough that you could detect, I don't want to say small improvements, but not large, but meaningful improvements. Like obviously if your house is in huge trouble and the plants are dying and then they aren't, you're like, okay, that worked. But mostly we're not talking about that. We're talking about crops that look pretty good, but you'd like to get, another half a pound per square foot or something. So just thinking about how to do that is the first step. And then getting it into the culture of your employees. Is it one person? Is it everyone? Like who has to do this? But the good news is you don't have to weigh every fruit in the whole tunnel to figure this out.
Yeah. I mean, an imperfect system would be better than no system at all for keeping track of this kind of thing. And I know a lot of people need to keep records for organic certification or something like that. But I guess that's an extra reason to go to the effort of keeping some records, because then you'll know. Then you'll know if that thing that you did is, making a difference or not, and whether it was worth it. So, okay. Well, I feel like you've been very generous with your time. I appreciate the insights, Vern. Just did want to ask if there's anything that I should have asked you that I didn't, or that you'd like to say before we let you go.
Well, you could ask me what everybody does. When are you going to retire? No, I am having a good time. I learn something every day. I love what I'm doing. So not yet is the answer.
Well, that's good, because I think you're doing important work, and we appreciate it. So
thanks for having me. It was great talking with you.
Okay. Hey, quick, where can people find you online, or UVM, or social media, or wherever you want people to look you up?
I am the only Vern Grubinger around, so you can Google and you'll find me. Email is a good way, vernon.grubinger@uvm.edu. But yeah, I got a bunch of stuff online, fact sheets, website. We have a VVBGA, that's Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association, YouTube channel where like all our winter webinars get posted back several years, and there's a lot of good stuff on there, including a lot of greenhouse sessions. So those are worth checking out. And yeah, if you're in the neighborhood, check out the VVBGA in general. We have a lot of out-of-state members too, and we have a sliding scale approach where if the membership fee is too much for you, you can pay anything, including zero. And that's a tool we're using to connect people through our listserv and on-farm workshops, annual meetings, etc.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, we'll connect all those dots for people down in the show notes. And great. Well, thank you very much, Vern. Appreciate all the information and insights over the years. Really appreciate what you're doing, and I think our audience does too.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Keep up the great work you're doing too.
All right. Thanks, Vern. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Growing for Market podcast. If you've been enjoying the show, please consider giving us a follow and a rating or a review. It really helps others find the podcast. For more tips and tricks from farmer to farmer, check out our magazine at growingformarket.com. Whether you're a commercial grower or just want to grow like one, subscribe to Growing for Market magazine for the nitty-gritty of growing, marketing, and the business of market farming. We publish 10 issues per year with articles written by experienced farmers on topics ranging from tools and techniques to farm business operations and marketing. If you've been listening to the Growing for Market podcast and haven't yet checked out Growing for Market magazine, we've made a change so you can try the magazine for free. We've added a free month to the beginning of all first-time subscriptions. Try out the digital or paper magazine for a month, and if it's not for you, cancel within 28 days and you'll never even get billed. All subscriptions get you a year of the magazine, plus 150 downloadable back issues from the last 15 years and over 1,700 archived articles. With digital subscriptions starting at just $39 a year, head on over to growingformarket.com and subscribe today to benefit from over 3 decades of writing by farmers, for farmers, in Growing for Market magazine.